Welcome, bienvenue. My name is Renee Ketchum, and I curate the cultural events of AFUSA, and I am very happy to welcome everyone to Sarah Bernhardt in New York and Paris, a conversation with Carol Ockman and Beth Gersh-Nesic. And grand merci to our sponsors, France Today and Bonjour Paris. As you all know now, AFUSA is the largest Alliance Française network in the world, helping 25,000 learners of French each year learn French, live French, and love French with the Alliance Française. We have a few wonderful national events coming up. We've got Adrian Leeds coming up, One Film, One Federation discussion on Bob Le Flambeur with the Melville Foundation, a wonderful book called The Paris Deception about the resistance at the museum, arts and culture during the German occupation, and many other events. So please go to afusa.org and select one of our cultural events. Few logistics, please stay on mute during the presentation. Stay on speaker view. All questions should be put in the chat for the last 15 minutes of our conversation. If you have technical issues, sign back in after a couple of minutes using the original Zoom link. This event is being recorded for our YouTube channel, and the total runtime is 1 hour. Carol Ockman is a writer, performer, curator, and world-renowned scholar of Sarah Bernhardt. Co-author of Sarah Bernhardt, The Art of High Drama, 2005, whose award-winning exhibition and catalog she and Kenneth E. Silver curated and wrote for the Jewish Museum in New York from 2005 to 2006. Sarah performs her memoir, Sarah Bernhardt's Handkerchief, as a one-woman show, which we can learn more about later on. Beth Gersh-Nesic specializes in the history of Cubism and the Cubist critics, most notably the poet, critic, André Salmon. She translated both of his books, published together in André Salmon on French Modern Art, Cambridge University Press, 2005. A revised translation of Salmon's La Jeune Peinture Française is now available in Pablo Picasso, André Salmon, and Young French Painting. Welcome to Carol and Beth for this conversation on Sarah Bernhardt.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much, Renee, for a lovely presentation. I really appreciate it. And Carol, thank you so much for everything. Just infiniment. Thank you so much for your patience, your time, and most of all, your knowledge and enthusiasm for dear Sarah. So before we go forward, I just want to thank the Jewish Museum of New York and the Petit Palais in Paris for furnishing some of the slides that we have today. Without them, we would not have such a wonderful presentation that we hope that you'll enjoy. Our focus is on the exhibitions and Sarah Bernhardt's legacy, which is brought to you by Carol Ockman and Ken Silver. But before we begin, I would like the audience to know about Carol, because she is amazing and so accomplished. So I want to begin with this question. How did you become an art historian?
Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation, Beth and Renee and Melissa, for all your hard work, and how I became an art historian is that I went to study abroad at age 19 in Italy, where I looked at everything. I spent an extra semester there, traveling all around Europe on a Europass, and strangely, after all that time in Italy, I looked only at modern art. And then just the summer before my senior year, I needed to make up that time that I had taken away. And I happened to be there when Linda Nochlin was a visiting professor. She would go on to become the legendary feminist art historian. She wasn't quite that yet, but I was in the very second seminar on women in art that she taught in 1971. I also read her paradigm-shifting essay, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists, which we still read all the time today, 6 months after it was published, and that was it. So I added an art history major to my Italian major, and eventually I got a PhD.
And then, how did it happen that you ended up looking at Ingres?
Well, that's a very long story, but to make it relatively brief, I was quite interested in his weird bodies, like the extra vertebrae in the spine of the reclining woman, the La Grande Odalisque that you see on the right, which is the cover of my book. And the book, it's divided so that there's a representative history painting, a representative nude, and a representative portrait, which brings me to the work on the left, which is Ingres' 1848 portrait of Baron James de Rothschild, Baron Betty. I knew Ingres' portraiture very well by then, and especially the portraits of female society women. And when I looked at this portrait of Baron Betty, I said to myself, strange, she doesn't look like any of the others. She's the only sitter with whom I'd like to have a conversation. All of the other ones, like the Comtesse d'Aussonville and the Princesse de Broglie, both of whom are here in New York, or Madame Moitessier, one version of which is in the National Gallery in London, another in the National Gallery in DC, they all were very forbidding, very closed off, very glacial. And Baron James de Rothschild was not that at all. First of all, she's leaning forward. She has her legs crossed, which is actually quite, quite not the thing for a society woman to be doing. It was a pose reserved for theater women. She's leaning forward, as I said, and her cheeks are very rosy, and you kind of think you could have a talk with her. And so I thought it was just perhaps because she was an exceptional woman, which she may have been, although we don't know because all the literature is about her husband. But I also sort of thought it might be because she's a Jew. I just had that impulse. And it was. I was able to show that the image reflected stereotypes of Jewesses in the 19th century. And so I became a little bit, as a result of this, someone who in people's minds knew about representations of Jews, which actually I didn't, except for this Jew. But that's how some of this begins.
So this led you to an invitation to write an article for Linda Nochlund's book, and we have Linda Nochlund in common, by the way, The Jew in the Text, and Sarah Bernhardt, that's our connection, actually. And you tell us a little bit about this article that you contributed to the book.
Well, I sort of thought, well, I have to contribute. Two of the great art historians, Linda and Tamar Garb, are editing this. And I thought, well, I could work on a 19th century French personage because I know about France in the 19th century. Or I could work on somebody 20th century from the US because I know about that. And at first I was going to do Sarah Bernhardt, and the stand-up comic Sarah Bernhardt, who was big in the 80s. And I got so captivated so quickly by Bernhardt, working on this essay that mostly talked about anti-Semitic caricatures of her, in fact, that I decided to drop Sandra. And mostly I was captivated by her multiple professions. For a woman of this time to be an actress, a sculptor, and a very fine one, a painter, a writer, a playwright, a theater impresario who owned her own theaters, et cetera, I thought it was quite astonishing. And so many of the caricatures show her multiple professions, including this one by Cabriol, which shows the mask of tragedy in the upper right corner, the palette in the upper left, the mallet and the calipers of sculpting on the bottom, and the lyre and the plume for declaiming and writing, etc. And she's set in a six-pointed star. One part is occluded by her head. It's an enormous head with Semitic features, very dramatized, particularly the eyes and the nose and the length of the face, if you will. And then there's also the unruly, frizzy hair for which she was known. And more than this is her pose. She's sitting splay-legged right up against the back of a chair, which no respectable woman would have done ever. And she's wearing pants. And she's wearing the costume that you see here. Thank you, Beth. Where she supposedly is wearing a white satin pantsuit designed by Charles Frederick Worth, the great couturier of the period, to sculpt in her studio. Now, clearly, this is absurd, but it also shows that Bernhardt was very fashionable and very interested in shock. Because women did not wear pants. You had to have a special dispensation, like George-Sand had to go to the theater, or Rosa Bonheur did to go to the slaughterhouses and paint animals. But Bernhardt, to my knowledge, did not have any such dispensation. She didn't go out wearing this outfit. And she manages to make even pants look extraordinarily feminine. And often the caricatures include these fabulous little white shoes that she's wearing with nœud de papillon, butterfly wings on the toes.
So how did you jump from this article, which was in 1995, to producing an exhibition?
Well, it's a bit of a story, but not a huge story. In the sense that from that moment, when 1994, when I started working on that essay, I continued to work on Bernhardt, and I was going to write a book on Bernhardt. And I got a grant to work on it. And while I was working on it, I get a query from Norman Kleeblatt, who was at the Jewish Museum then as a senior curator and an administrator. And we had been in conversation about his Dreyfus Affair show, which I liked so very much. And he said to me, how would you like to do a show on Sarah Bernhardt with me? And I thought, I'm primarily a communicator. That's what I like to do. I like to talk to people. I like to write for a large audience. And I thought, well, I'll get to reproduce a huge number of objects in talking about Sarah Bernhardt, and I'm an art historian. What could be better? So I said yes. And originally I was going to curate it with Norman, but he had too many administrative responsibilities. So he said, you can either do it on your own or invite someone. And as it turned out, I decided to invite my friend from graduate school, Ken Silver, professor at NYU. And I knew that although I was the Bernhardt scholar, he had a more experience curating, and that we shared an aesthetic vision. So that was how it happened. Yeah.
And then you created something very unusual for the Jewish Museum. This was perhaps a breakout exhibition of multimedia. So what are we looking at here?
Well, it's hard to read, but imagine that you enter the exhibition through a set of gigantic glass doors, which is how you enter all their first floor exhibitions. And right in the center, taking up that entire space practically, was a huge screen showing a clip from Billy Wilder's 1955 Seven-Year Itch with Marilyn Monroe comparing herself to Sarah Bernhardt. And I loved this idea that Ken and I simultaneously came up with together to begin the show like this. So in other words, what you're seeing in this space, which is the grand space of the exhibition with this wonderful défilé, you couldn't see anything but Marilyn when you opened the doors to the exhibition. And eventually you get into this long space, this pieced, right? And at the base of it, you can perhaps imagine, if you're old enough anyway, that you're reading the phrase, "Who do you think you are? Sarah Bernhardt?" We were very interested. I was particularly interested as a scholar of Bernhardt in her longevity, 60-year stage and screen career, but also her afterlife. So, I mean, I don't know how many in the audience are aware of this reference in the Billy Wilder film. I'm sure many of you have seen it. But everybody from John Barrymore and Judy Garland to Nicole Kidman and Annette Bening compared themselves, well, their characters did, to Sarah Bernhardt. They wanted to be like her because Bernhardt at the end of her career did film. And we'll talk certainly about that. But I loved that she survived in Hollywood and that she had the heft to become a phrase, a regular Sarah Bernhardt, Sarah Hartburn, etc. And I love that when Beth has a story about coming and seeing the exhibition and responding to this, which was in big blue neon letters.
Oh, yes, it was a shock. And you remember when Marilyn Monroe compares herself, she's doing a commercial and she's excited that more people will see her in a commercial than in the whole lifetime of Sarah Bernhardt. So it really was a very humorous beginning to a gorgeous, unusual, and glamorous show. So let's show a little bit more. What was your thoughts? What were your thoughts when you opened the show here? We had Marilyn Monroe and the neon, which was a showstopper. And then we turn into something that is elegant right here. Tell us what's happening.
Well, we had come up with this ginormous large format poster by the Czech artist Alfons Mucha, who many of you know is a famous Nouveau poster artist. And we wanted something big that would stand up to Marilyn. And it's certainly plenty big. So, 8 feet high. And it shows her in the role of Theodora, which she began performing in 1884, a melodrama written by Victorien Sardou, who wrote 8 melodramas for Bernhardt specifically. And we decided we always wanted, or I always wanted really, the wall color to be midnight blue, the color of celebrity. And so that runs throughout the show. And you can see that as you enter the exhibition after seeing Marilyn, you're going to see on the left wall these 3 photographs, which we gave a sort of pride of place because they're by Félix Nadar, the greatest portrait photographer of the 19th century. And we got the prints that he made. We got the original prints from Paris. So that was completely thrilling because the resolution of those images is stunning. And these images were made quite early. Bernhardt was 20. She had no real career yet as an actress. And in fact, she was probably working as a prostitute around this time. And yet, in some ways, they almost seem to foretell whom she would become. You know, there is the half column, the classical column there. There's that beautiful little bright earring that you see in both images. What is striking about them is the costume, if you will, because any respectable woman would have been wearing a fitted dress with a corset, and she is not. She is wearing what looks like a burnous in the photograph on the right, and a large cape, perhaps, of black velvet or a swath of velvet wrapped around her. And I think these are very suggestive because they're very easy to remove, put on and remove. And a 19th century woman who was respectable would not be in that kind of attire posing. So model, actress, prostitute, they were all on a certain kind of continuum at that time, the public woman.
And let's go to the next room. And we're looking at many, many aspects of her life. So tell us about what you decided to put into this room. This is eclectic.
Yes, I think the idea really was to suggest what the viewer would see and the range of objects, the type, the content that would be revealed throughout the show. So perhaps we can talk about the 2 in the foreground. The one on the left is her snake bracelet, which she commissioned from Alphonse Mucha, who was an exceptional jewelry designer as well as a poster designer. And he worked on this with perhaps the greatest jeweler of 19th century France, Georges Fouquet. And it is gold, solid gold, with, let me see, it has diamonds and rubies and opals and inlaid enamel. And there is a link for every part of the tail. So the front part that you can see at the bottom of the image, she put on her finger, and then the snake snakes up her arm, and you see it in Mucha's poster advertising her in the role of Medea on the left. But every time she moved her arm, that tail would swivel, would move. Just an astonishing object that came all the way from Japan, from a municipal collection. And the curator carried it in a suitcase that had been specifically designed for it. And it was thrilling. When he brought it out, it was on a black hand mannequin, a black velvet mannequin. And that's how we showed it in the exhibition.
Gorgeous. And also, not in the photograph that we received from the Jewish Museum, but in the same room, you told me this is where the Medici collar was placed.
Yes, which is ermine with Mongolian lamb wool trim, apparently. And the thing, I'm not sure if this is apocryphal or not, but it is somewhere in the literature that she apparently wore it around Paris, en ville. This was not for stage, in all 4 seasons, which only somebody like Bernhardt could have done had she wished.
And this was in the exhibition with, as you can see, the image of Abama. So explain that to us.
Yes, so this is, we had the marble bust, which you saw briefly in that grab bag of a room. This is a portrait of the rather successful painter at the time, 19th century, Louise Abema, who was Bernhardt's girlfriend, as in amorous liaison, and her most intimate relationship throughout her life. They knew each other from 1871 when they met, and Abema was leading the funeral procession when Bernhardt died in 1923, along with Bernhardt's son, Maurice. I have found it to be very significant, and it's often left out because people, I think, don't know what that bust is in the photograph on the right. However, it is really important to know that Bernhardt made that sculpture, that she and Abema decided that it would be nice to have Abema overlooking Bernhardt, supposedly dead in her coffin when she was only 35 years of age. I should just tell you that Bernhardt lived to be 79. So she had this image made. She basically had it in a postcard size format, and it would be sold at the theaters, because by the time Melandri made this photograph in 1880, Bernhardt was famous for dying. I mean, she was a great tragedian, so of course that would be part of what she would do. But she was so famous for dying that a death scene became de rigueur. Okay. And this is probably one of her most famous roles, certainly the one most performed. Here she is expiring as Marguerite Gautier in La Dame aux Camélias, written by Dumas. And she premiered this in 1880 on her first American tour. So it premiered in the United States, and it was captured in multiple versions by Napoleon Cerroni, the US-based photographer. And she, on that first American tour, she died nightly as Marguerite Gautier 65 times. And over the course of her career, she died over 3,000 times in this role. So it's quite important. And death is central to her oeuvre. I mean, to everything that she does as a performer, and in other veins too.
Indeed, indeed. And also she had a kind of macabre sensibility. We are looking at a stuffed bat.
Yes, we're looking at a taxidermied bat that was part of a hat that she wore around town. She was very into bats, and And I think that this has a large deal to do with the fact that Robert de Montesquieu, who was a very close friend of hers, wrote about them. And in the Petit Palais show, there's a beautiful edition of that book that has bats all over its cover that some of you may remember having seen. The eccentricities of Bernhardt are very, very striking. And if you want to know more about them, please ask for that in the chat.
Thank you. And a little bit more about her relationship with Abima. Let's talk about Abima herself. Who was she?
Well, she was a rather good painter and successfully exhibited for years. I mean, as long as Bernhardt performed, she exhibited at the Salon, which was, of course, the official exhibition space in Paris. That would mean that she was not a vanguard painter. She was not an impressionist or a post-impressionist by any means. And you see her on the left in her studio. What interests me, because Bernhardt was so much in her fashion on stage and around town, she was so toujours la femme, you know, whereas Abima was quite the opposite. Even though she wore skirts, she almost invariably wore waistcoats and starched shirts and ties or cravats of some sort. And you see her that way here. And also to some degree in the self-portrait, very early self-portrait by her.
Indeed. Going back to the show, another room. Tell us, what do we see here? This is a lot of clothing.
Yes. Well, thank you to the Bibliothèque Nationale, principally, because in one afternoon, when we finally got into their coffers in storage, we saw 30 costumes, about that same number of handbags, and a trove of jewelry, much of which we borrowed. And the two works in the foreground on that runway, if you will, were robes from Theodora. And you see the white leather vest that she wore in Joan of Arc. And in all the cases, there's a combination of jewelry, photographs, programs, other kinds of objects, and this fantastic standing mirror. Keep in mind that this is basically, you're looking at the entire length of the ground floor of the Jewish Museum, except for the gift shop, pretty much. And so that standing mirror was pretty large. It's mahogany, and it includes a huge embedded silver piece that says quand même, in spite of everything, against all odds, which was her motto. And that piece, like many of the pieces you'll see or saw in the Petit Palais exhibition.
And just to remind everybody, the reason that we are lavishing all this attention on Sarah Bernhardt this year is because she passed away 100 years ago. So here is an image of her when she was a child with her mom. Can you tell us a little bit about her mother?
Well, her mother was a very successful, which means high-class courtesan. And so was her aunt. She had come from Germany or Holland. I mean, I think that's slightly disputed. But she didn't pay a lot of attention to her daughter. She was rather busy with her protectors. And I think Bernhardt's love of the stage, love of attention in part, comes from her childhood. But her mother through her connection to the Duc de Rosny, managed to get Sarah Bernhardt an audition at the Comédie Française.
And then Sarah herself was a mother and a grandmother, things that some people don't actually know about her. So it was wonderful. Did you have this image in the Jewish Museum?
I don't recall that we did. We did have photographs. I don't know that we had Bernhardt with her granddaughter. We certainly had a photograph of her son, Maurice. We had a photograph, I believe, of the father of Maurice, the Prince de Ligne. And she had Maurice, her only child, out of wedlock when she was about 20. And he did not recognize his son. So, so Maurice was somebody who was very close to his mother. She, in turn, was very close to him. And that familial connection. He married a Polish princess and had a granddaughter. She was quite important to Bernhardt. Yes.
Good. That's wonderful to know, her domestic side as well as her celebrity side. Now, going back to the beginning of your show, this was quite an experience, and I really adored it. So let us compare. We're moving from a memory of what it looked like in New York to France. Here we're going to pivot now to Paris.
Great.
And what do you think? This is a title that's quite different from yours. What do you think they were trying to accomplish that might have been different from what you were trying to accomplish with your show?
Well, I think it's interesting, Beth, because we were talking about the title of their show yesterday or the day before. And their focus is not actually on how Bernhardt survived, as ours was, but it's much more historical and rather more chronological than ours. Also, a huge difference is that it's in Paris, that they had the resources of the entire Réunion des Musées Nationaux, all the national museums, and many French private collections. And they also had the space, a wonderful space for the exhibition, which is contemporary with Bernhardt's life, that enabled them to show 400 objects. We had 250, they had 400. So they multiplied a lot of what we did, to be sure. I think it is fascinating that the French press, not the Jewish press, the French press, described Bernhardt in this show as being presented as an influencer, which in a way certainly is true. But it's not a show that is as concerned with her afterlife as our show certainly was. And you're showing me the left wall of the first room, which has these wonderful montages, the wonderful montage of Bernhardt in a number of her roles, and also in her streetwear and her motto "Quand même" on the wall. So this is preparing us for the life and career of Bernhardt, which is their focus. Yes.
And this painting by Perrault, I just wanted to know what this was the 70s when she was still very young. So was she a sociétaire at that time?
She was a sociétaire by the mid to late 70s, to be sure. I'd have to check the date on that, actually. But she gave it all up because they were putting her in a role that she didn't like, and she offered her resignation, having better ideas, to go on tour first in London, and then to do this huge American tour that she did that took a full year. All of her American tours took a year. So that's quite astonishing. And so she resigned, and she actually had to pay damages to the Comédie Française for violating her contract. But she didn't care because she established her own company. And this is, I think, something that she knew very early on, that she wanted control, and she took it.
Amen.
Amen.
So her famous roles, just to help people, what are we looking at here?
We're looking at Phèdre, Racine. This was her most famous classical role that she started playing when she was 30. And she played it from then on. And these are both around 1880. You can see she's still very slender. Bernhardt was known, not in a flattering way, as the skinniest woman in France for, I'd say, 20 years. By the mid-1890s, she was not the skinniest woman in France any longer. But you can see how slender she appears in these images, and how lengthy the arms look, and how she pays attention to gesture and glance. She was known for a very highly expressive style of acting, and a physical style of acting that was described in its time as very feminine and was completely new at that time.
And here she is, I think, more characteristically with the grand gestures.
Yes. Theodora, the Empress of Byzantium, the first melodrama written for her by Victorien Sardou, perfect character, bloodthirsty, Byzantine empress. Byzantium was very in vogue in late 19th century France. You can think of artists like Gustave Moreau, for example. Bernhardt studied in great detail the decorations in Ravenna, and was quite studious about her research in general, and had a lot to say about the costumes and the set designs, particularly when she had her own theaters.
So Theodora, for people who don't know, if you go to Ravenna, you go to San Vitale, and it's a beautiful mosaic of her and her husband, Justinian.
Yes.
What about this room?
So this is part of that very first room where you see the photo montage. It's the other side, basically, and it's documenting some of her early roles. And I think it's fascinating that she had a kind of altercation with the Comédie Française already in the 60s. And so she left and went to play at the Odeon. And there she played a breeches role, her first, in 1869, a Florentine troubadour. And it's fascinating because I think this is not very well known either, that she played 18 breeches roles during the course of her career, including Hamlet, Lorenzaccio, L'Aiglon, or the Little Eaglet, many, many roles. And she was quite famous for them. She had a huge success in this role, as well as for her female characters. And at the Odeon, she became even more famous for having starred in plays by Victor Hugo, who wrote Gris Blas and Hernani. and she had the lead role in each. You see her here in a painting by Georges Clairin, who after Louise Abema was her most intimate friend, but not as far as, not really, I don't believe, a lover. I think he was homosexual, and other people would back me up on this. But you see a photograph on the right, which shows you clearly the crown. Here she is, the Queen of Spain, Maria de Noblesse, in this role. Yes.
And so you said spacious. This is a wonderful photograph that we got from the Petit Palais to show space and also a change of color. What was this like?
This is a magnificent space. And I found it interesting because at one point they do use midnight blue as a wall color, but here they've gone with almost a Pompeian red and these gilded classical pilasters on the wall, which I think is also very appropriate for Bernhardt, given her origins as a classical tragedian. And so we have here costumes, jewelry, stage designs, photographs, and they could blow up some of these photographs. And they had them on the backs of vitrines, which was very effective. Here you have Bernhardt as Cleopatra in 1890, also a play by Sardou, and you can see the amazing costume that she's wearing, which includes this fabulous girdle or belt, which is many turquoise colored beads, and one of her crowns, two of her crowns actually, and this one of the many pectorals. She had many costume changes. And what is fascinating about her costumes and accessories is that some of them actually use real jewels and were designed by people like Mucha or René Lalique. But they were all quite over the top. Excess was one of her trademarks, and certainly the Petit Palais does that very well.
And this room, you said, is your favorite.
It may be my favorite because it's full of Bernhardt sculpture, first of all, and because it's anchored by the greatest portrait, the greatest image of Sarah Bernhardt, which is this 8-foot tall portrait by Georges Clairin. And this room,
Should we go back?
Yeah, we don't have to, but it's devoted to Bernhardt sculpture, a couple of her paintings, which are on the walls, and paintings by Clairin and Abema of Bernhardt, including Bernhardt. And there are also caricatures on that wall that you can see in this image. That one is a particularly anti-Semitic one, that show her in her studio costume, for example.
Exactly. And this is the famous Clairin. Did you have this in your show?
We did not. We asked for it, certainly.
Yeah.
So at the time that we asked, which would have been at least a year in advance of the show, it was, the Petit Palais was renovating, and it was traveling around. And we were told quite clearly and nicely by the curators that unfortunately they couldn't lend it because the Petit Palais was about to reopen at precisely that time or close to that time. And they had to have what is really one of the jewels of their collection. So the Theodora poster did the same work, actually, we thought. We were happy about that. But it really, in a way, defines Bernhardt in the ways that, at least in the ways I understand her. So she's in her apartment where in a kind of space where she has plants and where she has this exotically draped and cushioned couch. And she's wearing what she often wears, which is white. And it's a gown that is bedecked with fur at the base and lots of fur below. She's holding a white feather fan. She always sat in a kind of spiral, a serpentine pose, if you will, which is extended by her wolfhound at the base of that painting. And you see a similar thing in the trim here of the gown she's wearing in Abema's huge, probably 8 feet across, painting called Déjeuner dans la Serre, which actually Clarin's portrait was shown in the Salon of 1876. And Abema had also made a large portrait that was shown that year, but it was lost. And so I wanted to show you a big work by Abema, and Beth and I did. And that's Abema behind her, and behind the table are Abema's parents and an unknown family friend, we're not sure of his identity, and an unidentified child. And you can see like the rich carpeting and the rich hangings and curtains, etc. All very, and there's even some fur in there. Bernhardt liked fur. She liked wild animals a great deal and collected them.
And she herself became a somewhat mythological character.
Yes.
So we're going to go through her sculptures. We're going to go through her sculptures quickly because the hour is now almost nigh. This is her own work of art.
Yes. So I don't know how much I should say, but it's a self-portrait as a chimera with bat's wings and griffin's claws. And it is in the form of an inkwell, and you can actually insert a pen into her hair, which you see on the left. And there's a receptacle there for ink in the front. So this is macabre and eccentric. It's perfect Bernhardt, yes.
And this is her lover.
Yes, this was actually briefly her husband, Jacques Damala, a Greek actor. Not a very successful one, as it turned out. And oh my goodness, I see an interesting question. This is his disembodied head, almost on a salver like John the Baptist. Very moving work.
And these are her creations. Very original.
I love these algae sculptures. We had the one on the right in our show. The Petit Palais had 5, which was extraordinary because they're rarely seen and they're hard to come by. And they're part Nouveau and part abstraction. They're quite amazingly fanciful and modern, bold. Yes,
indeed. And she made Mucha. She launched his career.
Absolutely. He was under contract to her to make posters advertising her roles from 1896 to 1901. He completed 7 of these. They all have the same format. Repetition and variation was something she, and it turned out he, understood very, very well. A model of mass production, if you will, that they launched. Figure in a niche, in profile or head on, title of the play, name of the theater, La Dame aux Camélias, Lorenzaccio, and La Samaritaine, three of her roles here, yes.
And she was also endorsing products.
Yes.
Before celebrities did that, she invented that as an idea.
She certainly did, Beth. So we have Lou biscuits, which still exist, Paris soap, which still exists. I don't know whether Terminus absinthe bienfaisant still exists. It may well. She had an uncanny sense for publicity. And she established the model for celebrity as we know it with advertising, among other things. She went and had her voice recorded by Thomas Alva Edison in 1880 when she first went to the US. She went to Menlo Park. There she is listening to her voice, which we have, and I can talk more about that. Well, if there's a question about it in the chat, I could maybe answer it. And she advertised many health and beauty products, including rice powder, La Diaphane, in a poster by another extremely noted poster artist, Jules Chéret.
Exactly. And she had her own theater.
Yes, and this is kind of amazing because she starts out renting theaters, the Théâtre de l'Ambigu. She took a lease on the Théâtre de la Porte Saint-Martin. She bought the Théâtre de la Renaissance, and then she took a 25-year lease on a theater in the Place du Châtelet, which became the Théâtre Sarah Bernhardt in 1899. And she had that theater till she died. During Vichy, it was renamed Théâtre de la Ville, and many of you may know it as that. And Beth was the first to tell me, and I've since confirmed that it has been renamed the Théâtre Sarah Bernhardt, and maybe somebody who's listening today has seen it because when I was in Paris to see the exhibition, for example, and when Beth was last in Paris, it hadn't yet changed. So this is very exciting.
It is indeed. It's just reopened after 7 years of renovation. So the article's in the New York Times. And she was in film.
Yes, and here in 1911, when she's 68, she's playing Marguerite Gautier in La Dame aux Camélias. And she looks a lot broader and a lot older, to be sure. However, look at the arch of that body. That's training, folks. Yeah. And she holds the hanky in that.
She's holding the hanky in this one, yes.
Yeah.
So we're going to end with our dear Andy Warhol.
Yes. She was one of 10 portraits of Jews from the 20th century, a series that he made in paintings and also in silk screens. And here's a silk screen version on the left. All of these portraits are of dead Jews, and they're all based on photographs, very Warhol. And here is the photograph by Cerrone of her in La Dame aux Camélias. They both had this incredibly instinctive understanding of mass production and mass media and new technologies. And really, Bernhardt invented the modern concept of celebrity as we know it. And Warhol just made it his own. I could go on or I could stop there. If there's time for a question or two, I'd be delighted.
I think
Carol
it's
and Beth, we're running out of time. You
Yeah.
have captivated us with so much information that we know we can follow up with when everybody receives all the fabulous links that you've provided us with. But I would like to address one question in the chat. This group is, we've just had an incredible conversation last week on Proust. And there's a wonderful question from Ferrichte Prio saying that Sarah Bernhardt always reminds me of the Proustian character La Burma. I'm sure he saw her in the play Phèdre that he likes so much. Is it true that she inspired Proust, and how much did they know each other? And are there any writings that might testify to that?
Well, yes. First of all, they were acquainted. They knew each other slightly, and largely because they shared friends, close friends, including the art song composer Reynaldo Hahn, including Robert de Montesquieu, whom I have already mentioned, and Charles Haas, who was one of the inspirations for Swann. Okay, so there is that. They didn't know each other well, but there is a fabulous passage in Proust where he mentions the most distinguished actresses. And he actually also, in Proust, as some of you may know, certainly our questioner knows, there's some historical mentions of Bernhardt in À la recherche du temps perdu. But Berma is also based on this historical personage. So when describing the most distinguished actresses, he mentions Sarah Bernhardt, Berma, Julia Barthé, Madeleine Brohan, and Jeanne Samary. So all of these are actually real people, except Berma, who's his own creation, who's a hybrid of Bernhardt. Now, the thing that I can suggest to read is actually Kenneth Silver's essay in our catalog. If you want to know more about Bernhardt overall, you should read my essay. But if you want to know about Bernhardt and Proust and Bernhardt during the period of World War I, you should definitely read Kenneth Silver's essay in our catalog. So I hope that answers your question.
I'm sure Ferrichte is thrilled. She runs a fascinating Proust group that many of us are members of. So we want to thank you both so much. And I know we have a question here as to how everyone can access the references. So we will receive, I think tomorrow, a acknowledgement of your registration with the links, and then with the confirmation that you will receive this recording, I think probably on Monday. So all the links will be highlighted. Anybody that does not receive the link can contact me or AFUSA and or your local alliance, and we'll find you. But the links have been provided for everyone who signed up for this wonderful conversation on Sarah Bernhardt. We are so grateful to Carol Ockman and to Beth Gersh-Nesic, and I think that maybe there's a series of conversations that need to be continued. I don't think we have time to hear about her eccentricities, which you had mentioned as a teaser, but we look forward to learning more. We look forward to looking at the links, and we look forward to looking for you in person in your one-woman show as that appears in the near future. So thank you to you all, to all of you, and have a wonderful holiday season.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Will I be able to see the chat? Because I'd love actually to answer a few of these questions. I'd be happy to answer the questions if that were possible.
Sure. If people want to stay.
If somebody wanted to know about Bernhardt's handkerchief and City Company, and I would love to field that question.
Is anybody still here? Because you're co-host, so there might still be somebody here.
Yes, I'm co-host. So
David
if people want to stay, we're here. So you're welcome. The recording can end, but
exactly, we have nobody to shut you down. So Melissa left. So anybody who would like to stay and continue the conversation, please stay. And Beth and Carol are here to answer any of your questions in the chat.
Thank you. Exactly. So the recording's still going on? Yes?
Yes.
Okay.
Well,
Fire away.
I do want to say what happened to Sarah Bernhardt's handkerchief, which was a handkerchief that was given to a great American actress in about 1910, and has been passed on ever since and is still in circulation. That handkerchief was in our show in that very first room. And we didn't have time to talk about it today. And I'm very happy to report that I'm going to be doing an interview with the BBC Radio 3 that is going to be aired in December. I don't have any further information. And part of it will be on the handkerchief. And at least one of the actors who had the handkerchief, Cherry Jones, will be part of that interview, which is grand. So I became, in a way, the historian of the handkerchief by having requested the loan and then getting to know Cherry Jones, who had it at the time, around events pertaining to its loan, and then a performance that she and Anne Bogart, founder and executive director of City Company, maybe one of the greatest, certainly maybe the greatest repertory company in the United States, they brought a performance that I was in. And unfortunately, there's no recording of that, because that's what I really love you to see. But it was amazing to be performing with people like Cherry Jones and Deborah Winger and Ellen Lauren, who is like the quintessential actor's actor from City Company, and Lynn Cohen, who played Golda Meir in Spielberg's Munich, and also Cynthia Nixon's housekeeper in Sex and the City. If you want to, like Bernhardt, go, classical and popular simultaneously, I think it's perfect what has come about with her reputation and this handkerchief too. So it's still around, still in someone's possession, and Helen Hayes had it and Julie Harris had it. So that's the full. It's not the full answer, but it's a substantive answer to a question I love to answer. And thank you to my friend and colleague David Epple from Williams in theater, who knew all about this and who came to the performance at the Jewish Museum in 2005. Yeah.
And we have a link to your performance at the Jewish Museum when you were answering questions at Sarah Bernhardt. And that was also another one. And we have the link for that. We have the link for the performance of Bernhardt's handkerchief that will come to people. And that's on Vimeo.
I just have to interrupt, because Lovely Air is one of the directors of that one-woman show at Williams, the one that's on Vimeo, and has not actually been publicly released before. So, I mean, I have performed it actually on the West Coast and on the East Coast, but not before the kind of audience that the Fédération might enable to view it. So that's a big move for me. And I thank you, Beth, for your extraordinary interest and care in all aspects of this conversation. I'm happy to thank David, who is sitting right there, for giving me that opportunity or helping me make that performance at Williams. I'm happy to answer any other questions for those who are still here, and I'm happy to end it if that's what's appropriate at this time. I see there are questions in the chat, but I don't.
At this particular moment, yes.
But I don't know that any of
If
those.
someone would
people
like to ask
here.
a question or unmute, it's up to you.
Does anybody else have a question who's still here? Because otherwise, I'll try to answer those questions if I can do that afterwards, so we don't take
Okay.
people's time who don't want to hang out for longer.
I think this is it. I think it's time for us to say good night. Thank you, Carol. This was
Thank you all for
extraordinary.
coming. Thank you. I so enjoyed it. Thank
I
you.
enjoyed it too. À la prochaine.
À la prochaine. Be well, everyone. Thank you.
Okay. Good night.
Renee.
Good night. Thank you for coming.